Good morning. Today we're going to be exploring Act 4 Scenes 2 and 3 of Macbeth. And on the video now you can see that there's a series of tasks that I would like you to complete in your books by the end of this video. So you can do it at your own pace, but I have given you little time reminders throughout so you can see how much you should be spending on each task. Now, the first thing I'd like us to consider is how much Macbeth has changed during the course of the play. He's gone from being this revered war hero in Act 1, Scene 2 to this murderous tyrant by Act 4, Scene 1, which is when he decides to have Macduff's wife and children killed. For no real reason other than to spite Macduff. Macduff isn't with them, he knows that to be true, but he still decides to kill them out of spite. So what I would like you to do is, in your books, write a response to that question. How has Macbeth changed? If you're confident with that, then I'd like you to consider to what extent do you believe that Macbeth still possesses the traits of a good leader? I'm going to ask you to pause this video for 5 minutes whilst you write your response, and then continue with it. Pause now. Okay, before we move on to Act 4, Scene 2 properly, I thought it might be helpful to give you a summary of the events that happen in this scene. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to make a note of this information in your books. Obviously, copying it isn't ideal, so if you can put it into your own words, that would be even better. And if you learn best by drawing pictures, then make sure you label them too. So in this scene, Lady Macduff is with her son and Ross, who's another Thane. Ross informs her that Macduff has fled to England, and she accuses her husband of cowardice because of this. Ross then leaves. A messenger arrives and warns Lady Macduff that she's in danger. And as soon as the messenger leaves, murderers arrive, they kill Macduff's son and pursue Lady Macduff, who dies off stage, but we later learn that she has been killed. So it's important to know that this is the event of that scene, even though we're only going to focus on a small part of it. So condense that information, pause this tape for 5 minutes, now. Okay, now that you know what happened in the scene, I'd just like to focus on one part in particular, and it's this. Obviously, to a 17th century audience watching Macbeth for the first time, honour is a highly valued thing. It's incredibly important, especially for men. And prior to the murder, Lady Macduff and her son were talking about what it means to be honourable. And of course, this is ironic because Macduff is being honourable in what he's doing, but she doesn't know this. So she dies not realising how great her husband is. So, structurally, why do you think that Shakespeare made the choice to have these two characters talking about the significance of honour immediately before they die? Think about how it juxtaposes Macbeth when you're thinking about an ideal leader. It might also be worth thinking about how you can link this to the context. So it seems that Macbeth is able to easily find a range of people to commit these murders on his behalf. So what could Shakespeare be revealing here about society at that time? So pause it for 5 minutes. Task 3, go. Before we look at Act 4, Scene 3, which is a much longer scene, it's important to know that you're familiar with these two characters. Because there's so many characters in Macbeth beginning with M, people do tend to get them a little bit muddled. So Malcolm is Duncan's eldest son, King Duncan's eldest son, and he's the rightful heir to the throne. He fled from Scotland after Duncan's murder because he was worried he'd be accused. So he's currently in England. His brother is in Ireland. Now with Malcolm is Macduff, who has been suspicious of Macbeth right from the very beginning. He's the Thane of Fife, and he's an honourable man, and he's obviously with Malcolm in England. So if you've forgotten who these characters are, you need to make a note of it before you move on. Now, during this scene, Malcolm, understandably, is suspicious of Macduff, and so he decides to test his loyalty by pretending to be even more evil than Macbeth. He kind of lists a range of negative qualities that would make a terrible king, just to see how Macduff reacts. And eventually, Macduff kind of breaks down a little bit and laments for Scotland, which convinces Malcolm, who then retracts his confessions of evil. because once he sees that Macduff is genuine and opposed to Macbeth's tyranny, Malcolm tells him that he has English support for invading Scotland and reclaiming the throne that's rightfully his. Ross, one of the Thanes, arrives and informs Macduff that his family have been murdered, and Macduff then resolves to support Malcolm and vows to kill Macbeth himself. What I would like you to do is to condense this information into your books. You can either write it or draw a picture with labels to help you to remember, and I'd like you to spend 5 minutes doing this. Pause now. So in order to develop our AO2 skills, it's really important that we analyse language in depth. So I'd like you to look at this quote from Malcolm, which is when he's kind of saying to Macduff, actually, I don't completely trust you yet. And he says, this tyrant, whose sole name blisters our tongues, was once thought honest. You've loved him well. He hath not touched you yet. I'm young, but something you may deserve of him through me, and wisdom to offer up a weak, poor, innocent lamb to appease an angry God. So I'd like you to consider which reasons Malcolm gives for why he doesn't trust Macduff yet. Obviously, at this point, Macduff hadn't learnt of his family's murder. So Malcolm still feels that Macduff might be using him in order to win favour with Macbeth, and it might all be a bit of a trick, and he's worried that he'll be betrayed once again. If you are already confident with what this quote means, I would like you to instead analyse how Shakespeare uses figurative language here. So why doesn't Malcolm trust Macbeth? Using the quote to help. Write your response in your book for 5 minutes. Pause now. So, developing our understanding of language and how we can zoom in on particular quotes. I've given you 2 key quotes that Malcolm says in this scene. So I'm going to ask you to copy out the quotations and annotate around them using the questions to prompt your notes. So the first one is, beneath the yoke it weeps, it bleeds, and each new day a gash is added to her wounds. In this quote, Malcolm is talking about Scotland. So he's increasingly worried that Scotland is falling further into Macbeth's tyrannical rule, and he's almost speaking about the country as if it's injured. And I'd like you to think about the effect of personifying Scotland. Why does Shakespeare decide to do that? And if you can identify a semantic field here, it would make your response even stronger. So remember, a semantic field is a group of words that are all associated together under the same sort of theme. So the semantic field of fairy tales might be once upon a time, princess, witch. So try to identify a semantic field for that quotation. It might be helpful to pause here and do the quotes one at a time. You decide. The second quote is when Malcolm is trying to convince Macduff that he's an even worse ruler than Macbeth would be. So there's no bottom, none, in my voluptuousness. Your wives, your daughters, your matrons, and your maids could not fill up the cistern of my lust and my desire. Here, Malcolm's effectively saying that he's so kind of sexually driven that he's happy to sleep with absolutely anyone and has no qualms about it. So he's kind of claiming that he'd be even worse a ruler than Macbeth because of these qualities. Now we know that he's only saying these things to test Macduff, but why do you think Shakespeare had Malcolm use this strategy? Why list all these negative qualities in order to prove himself ultimately as a good ruler? Okay, I think it should take you about 10 minutes to complete these quote explosions in total. Go now. Okay, secondly, we're going to look at some key quotations from Macduff, and this should probably take you the same amount of time. So you're going to once again copy out the quotations and annotate them using the questions to form your ideas. So the first thing he says is about Macbeth. I grant him bloody, luxurious, avaricious, false, deceitful, sudden, malicious, smacking of every sin that has a name. So what I'd like you to do is obviously, how does Macduff feel about Macbeth? Not particularly positively. And the connotations of each of those underlined words. And I only noticed as I was reading it aloud that there's a lot of sibilance in there. So how could we link that sibilance to the idea of sin as well? You might have to look some of the words up. The second quotation is this, and it's once Macduff has finally cracked under the pressure of Malcolm's words when Malcolm's pretending to be terrible. And he says, "Fit to govern? No, not to live. O nation miserable, when shalt thou see thy wholesome days again? O my breast, thy hope ends here." And this shows how he feels towards Malcolm at this point. He's almost despairing. He feels like there's no hope for Scotland anymore. Nothing is going to repair it. And if you look at the punctuation as well, that really reveals the strength of his emotion too. So I'd like you to copy those out and annotate them, and this should take you about 10 minutes. So pause the video now. Okay, so we know that the point of Malcolm's lies is because it's only when he sees Macduff break down about how terrible the situation is in Scotland that Malcolm believes that he's loyal. And it's at this point that he tells Macduff that he'll work with him to overthrow Macbeth. He knows he can trust him now. However, after this agreement is made, Ross then enters, and after waiting for a little while, tells Macduff about the murder of his family. And this part is important because it's helpful in juxtaposing the characters of Macduff and Macbeth. So in the purple, you've got Macduff's reaction when he hears of his wife and children's death. What? All my pretty chickens and their dam at one fell swoop? And it's this kind of tender imagery that reveals how distraught he is about hearing their deaths. And that can be juxtaposed with Macbeth's reaction to Lady Macbeth's death. He simply says, "She would have died hereafter. Out, out, brief candle." And that metaphor's talking about life. There's no particular strength of feeling. He's almost nihilistic at this point. He stops caring. So task 7 is for you to write your response to this question. What's the effect of these differing reactions? And what do they reveal about Macduff and Macbeth's characters? 5 minutes. Do it now. Okay, your final task for this lesson is to consider this. Many directors choose to cut Act 4 Scene 3 from a play because it is incredibly long. So, to what extent do you agree that this scene is a crucial scene which should be included in its entirety? So should the whole thing be included? And you could think about which parts of this scene are the most crucial, which parts could you argue to leave out, and structurally, what's the significance of this scene in relation to the whole play? Why did Shakespeare include it? Why at this point? And what does it tell us about those characters? If I've just been rambling at you for the last 13 minutes, which is quite possible, and you're confused about anything, please email me and I will clarify anything for you. My final slide is of my cats, obviously. Here they are. They won't leave me alone. Hope you're all keeping safe. Take care. Bye.